Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining us for the penultimate Omaha Institute Digital Humanities Digital Projects Coffee House for this term. My name is Jim Ambuske of George Mason University, joined as always by Martha Howard of the Omaha Institute. And we're delighted to have you back with us again today for another exciting presentation featuring actually one of my colleagues from George Mason University. Dr. Jessica Otis is a newly associate professor of history and the director of public projects at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason. And her first book is out last year called By the Numbers, Numeracy, Religion, and the Quantitative Transformation of Early Modern England, which was published by Oxford University Press, looking at changing standards of numeracy in the 16th through the 18th century England. And so if you need help with your math homework, Jessica is also a person to go to as well. And she's here to talk to us today about her current project, Death by Numbers, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. It's a project I hear a lot about around the office, including students asking questions about the unusual ways peoples expired in this period. And Jessica's going to tell us a lot about the structure of this project and the history behind it right now. Jessica, the floor is yours.
So, hopefully, the title of this talk has already given it away. But just in case, I do want to start off by warning that people are going to die in this talk. I'm going to talk a lot about death. Deaths that my team has transcribed this week range from someone killed with a silk thrower's star and an overturned coach to the standard tuberculosis, measles, and smallpox, which are regular killers. Even more people are going to die of plague in this talk, as my plague doctor graphic has warned you. All right, so let's start by setting the scene. Imagine it's November of 1665, and plague is ravaging the city of London, the capital of England. A man named Samuel Pepys attends a sermon where the chaplain complains about human attempts to understand the natural world. He says, all of our physicians can't tell what Nagu is, and all of our arithmetic is not able to number the days of a man. Pepys records this in his diary, but adds his own opinion as well, which God knows is not the fault of arithmetic, but that our understanding reached not that thing. While the men and women of 17th century England didn't yet have the ability to differentiate causes of human fevers or quantitatively predict human lifespans, they believed that they would eventually be able to do both. And indeed, for the last 100 years, they'd been avidly attempting to use numbers to understand and predict the spread of plague and their chances of dying from plague through a series of documents known as the London Bills of Mortality. It's those bills that form the basis of Death by Numbers, the digital history project that I'm going to talk about today. And as my mention of a team earlier suggests, I am not doing this by myself. So here is a shout out to the current team. You can see the whole team on the website, including project alumni. I, along with my various student research assistants and a staff developer, have been transcribing these historical sources and uploading them to the website where they can be accessed through an API, CSV downloads, or a graphical user interface. The London Bills of Mortality were created in response to outbreaks of plague in 16th and 17th century England. This is during what's called the Second Pandemic, periodic waves of infection that occurred in the British Isles from the 1340s to about the 1670s. There's some question of when it actually disappears. The most well documented of these epidemics happened in cities, especially the capital city of London, which not only was by far the largest city in the kingdom, but it was the center of royal government. There were six major epidemics in the century from 1563 to 1665, and they lost just shy of 250,000 people to plague. The population of London is only 100,000 people in 1550, makes it up to 200,000 in the early 1600s. So this is a huge percent of the population of the city that is dying of plague in this time period. Unlike various Italian city states, England never had a medieval royal plague policy. Not until 1517, there was a disease outbreak that infected a large part of the royal court, including Anne Boleyn, which is like my favorite counterfactual. What if Anne Boleyn had died of plague in 1517? And it's in the aftermath of this disease outbreak that the Lord Chancellor, Cardinal Wolsey, drafts England's first kind of kingdom wide plague policies. And this included the requirement to compile numerical summaries of local plague deaths. So the cities in this time period, I mean, the whole kingdom, but especially the cities, are divided into parishes. This is the smallest administrative unit of the Catholic Church, later the Church of England. And the parish clerks are later tasked by Wolsey to keep a register of baptisms, marriages, and burials, these key ceremonial moments when people interact with the church. So now they're also asked to submit causes of death associated with those burials to the government to be compiled. The system mostly only works in London. Other cities sometimes do it during outbreaks and then let their statistics collecting fall by the wayside when it's over. The information is collected largely by women, known as the searchers for the dead, who examine corpses and declare the causes of death. Um, some of them are named diseases, but for the most part, they make symptom based diagnoses of causes of death, right? They don't care what gave you the convulsions, you died of convulsions. End of story. And this actually makes it possible to diagnose with a high degree of accuracy based on viewing the corpse or symptoms reported by family and friends. It's a bit like the modern diagnosis of flu like symptoms. Like they don't care if it's the flu, they just tell you you have flu like symptoms. It's a similar sort of historical diagnosis. So they submit this to the parish clerks, who then submit it to their worshipful company, their local guild. And this company is the one responsible for compiling and sharing this information every Thursday. And this data is initially circulated in manuscript form. It's just a simple count of deaths by plague, which you can see here. And this may not seem like a big deal. You know, they want to know when the numbers are starting to spike so they can run away or implement quarantines or whatever, write their wills. It all seems very logical to us. But prior to this, European tracking of plague was always qualitative. They listed infected cities and had corresponding travel passes. Within cities, they might have lists of the dead, who died, their name, their age, their profession, where. The bills of mortality jettison all of this contextual information and they just quantify death. And so we see then this is part of a larger emergence of a probabilistic way of thinking in early modern England. The mere concept that whether or not you get sick is something that follows natural laws with natural causes and can be predicted through quantified data, rather than the inexplicable manifestation of God's will, right? So people still pray to God to get them through plague epidemics, but then they also look at the numbers and use those to make informed decisions about risk. And it's not a one off set of numbers, but a weekly publication with annual summaries that they invest significant time and resources into producing for over 300 years. Um, so these evolve over time, right? Over the several hundred years. They get to be more complicated. The copies submitted to the monarch include all causes of death, not just plague. This here is a bill submitted to Queen Elizabeth in 1591. Um, Over here, we have one that was submitted to King Charles II in 1666. And in the 17th and 18th century, they sort of evolve into this form that then they handwrite and they fill in the information. Um, and for all of these, we get all the different causes of death. So you can see, might be a little hard, but you can see people dying of plague, chrisms, consumptions, convulsions, dropsy, right? You can see all the different ways people are dying and in what parish they're dying of each of these causes. Um, but even though these other infectious diseases are present, we can see over here, this is the list of all burials. And here we have a special call out for plague burials. So plague continues to be the heart of what they're collecting here. Everything else is just icing on the cake. Um, so by the end of the 16th century, there's a growing popular interest in knowing this data. They know the government has it, they would really like to have it as well. And so when the epidemic breaks out in 1603, local printers began printing this weekly bill of plague deaths. So they could sell it to the population at large, and ordinary people had access to the data. That's much simpler than what was submitted to the monarch. It really just focuses on plague deaths. And the bill format morphs a little bit over this first year of publication. And some of the bills, they devote extra space to burials from previous epidemics or to previous weeks in the current epidemic. You get sum totals, running totals, just to kind of contextualize how bad 1603 really is shaping up to be. And the bills proved to be super popular. Evidence suggests they actually had to use two printing presses so they could get 6,000 copies a week turned around. And the city at this point has a population of about 141,000. So we're talking about 4% of the population bought one. And then, of course, they shared the numbers on with their friends and their families. People discussed them with members of their household, with their friends. They showed up in sermons preached weekly. This is one of my favorite little excerpts from one of these sermons where the preacher is exhorting his parishioners to cool not in your devotion because the number of buried in our parish has fallen, blessed by God, from 305 to 51 in 1 week and from 57 to 4 buried in 1 day. Shall our love cool when God's love is kindled? Right. So for this particular preacher, proof of God's love is literally in the numbers. And so it's very likely that a significant minority of the city's population had access to some of these numbers over time. I call it the 1603 epidemic, but really it lasted 8 years. It gets worse every summer, dies down in the winter. And indeed, in this era, plague is a late summer disease. It's a bad year when it overwinters. So the weekly bills stabilize and they become a regular feature of 17th century London life. This quote is from 1636, another plague outbreak, where preachers notice their parishioners' obsession with obtaining the data from the bills. People who had business in London required their agents to send them copies every week. By the 1665 outbreak, newspapers such as the London Gazette are being published, and they faithfully include weekly summaries of the bills. And then diarists such as Samuel Pepys, who we saw at the beginning of this, record the numbers in their diary and use them to plot their movements around the city. So by the middle of the 17th century, the format of the weekly bills standardized to include London parishes, along with the parishes in the adjacent counties and city of Westminster. Basically, the city of London eats Westminster. And what today we would call the Greater London metro area is what contemporaries call within the bills. So anything encompassed by the Mills of Mortality is their definition of the sort of Greater London area. And in all of these 17th century bills, we get the total number of deaths in each parish, total deaths from plague, subtotals for the city within the ancient Roman walls, right outside the walls, in the city suburbs, in the city of Westminster. And then they've also expanded beyond plague to give us city-wise summaries of ways other people are dying. It's simpler than what the Monarchs Bill uh, has, but we are still getting to see, for example, here, I'll start with the good news. 17 people died of old age. Great. That's a great way to go in the early modern period. However, the big killers this week are not old age. They are almost always consumption, convulsions. Over here, this is a bad week for unspecified fevers, griping in the guts, stomach ailments, and then teeth is often another big killer. So these are kind of the standard ways to die. And we see other ones in here. One of my favorites always will be evil, dying of evil, aka King's evil, which is lymphatic tuberculosis, but it's just got the best name. So we can see that this is sort of citywide data, but we also get very geographically specific data for accidents and drownings. So here we have 4 drownings, one at St. Catherine Tower, one at St. Paul Shadwell, and 2 at Stepney. So we do get some granular data in here. We also get christenings by gender. So we can see that there were 229 people christened, 108 male, 121 female. And then we also get the burials by gender here. And you'll notice we had 336 people die and only 229 people be born. Yes, the city is a demographic sink. It's a death trap. And then last but not least, my entertaining favorite piece of this is the price of bread, which was set by the government to avoid price gouging. And so this is kind of like their public announcement of the price of bread every week goes on here. And by the 18th century, actually, this expands. We get much more detailed, granular information on the price of bread, and they also include the price of salt. So this is apparently a very important way to let people know what they should be paying for these basic staples. And they expect that the bills of mortality is what's going to get these the widest circulation. Um, and they also, in the 18th century, begin tracking age at time of death, which is of great interest to people doing demographic studies of this time period. So as that kind of suggests, my segue here, right? The bulk of the work the Death by Numbers Project has been transcribing and publishing this data. But obviously, we're not just doing it for the love of random numbers, we're doing it because we want to analyze it. So one of the first things that we did was visualize the 1665 outbreak to investigate how plague spread across the city parishes. And so you can see here, the redder parishes are the ones where plague happened first. The bluer parishes are the ones where plague happened latest. So we can see then plague breaks out here. It spreads in these sort of these large suburban parishes first, before making its way into the city walls and then slowly like deeper into the city, except for poor St. Michael in Cornhill had a very early plague case. We also looked at the 1665 Great Fire of London that burned down much of the city, to see how it actually impacted plague mortality in its immediate aftermath. There's kind of like a high level idea that floats around in the literature that like the fire wiped out whatever plague was left in the city. We're like, okay, let's visualize it and see what it shows. Um, if you want to be technical, yes, there is not really plague within the city walls anymore because there's no one within the city walls. The whole city is burned down. Um, but if we look at the greater area of the bills of mortality, we can see blue parishes where plague deaths were indeed falling, and then red parishes show where the numbers of plague deaths are actually rising, likely to people fleeing the fire and carrying their fleas with them, and the sort of stresses that come from being made homeless from this sort of natural disaster. Most of the completed projects that we've actually done to date are very small research projects done by student workers on the team. I was kind of the opinion when I wrote this grant for the NSF that went ahead and funded a lot of this work, that transcribing the data is fascinating and it immediately like raises questions. And so the grant provided for students to do some of their own projects based on what they were seeing in the bills. So this is a small project that was done by a PhD student, Hernan Adasme, who did some time to event analyses on the 1636 outbreak. So similar to the kind of work that I was doing on 1665. You can see the URL for the blog post here. You read all about it. We had an MA student, Cecilia Ward, who was looking at annual mortality trends. And you can see in this the 1665 spike of deaths that came from the plague outbreak. But you can also, in general, see how the deaths every week or every year, these are annual summaries, were worse than the number of people being born. And so she was looking at kind of the demographic sink of the city. And then I have a student who's on the project. She started as an undergraduate student and then continued as an MA student, Katie Tanya. She was working on the monarchical bills with me, and the one that gives the greater granularity of data. And so this is a visualization we put together of all the parishes and the ways people are dying in each of the parishes. So you can see like St. Giles within Cripplegate. We have a lot of griping in the guts and consumption, but also fever, teeth, dropsy, and then old age. I'm always happy when old age pops up as a way for people to die. It's a great one. And we actually have a co-authored article that we've submitted for publication, fingers crossed. It's a pretty big deal for an MA student. As for me, though, the big question, the one that motivated this project in the first place, is about the mathematics and the early modern use of the numbers in the bills. So as you've seen, these numbers are very precise, right? There's no rounding here. They're supposed to be an exact count. However, it's difficult to judge how accurate they were after 400 years. Lots of people have studied the data creation pipeline, especially with the focus on the searchers of the dead and their diagnoses, but no one's really looked at the math, how the numbers are transferred, totaled, transformed, which is what I'm particularly interested in. Uh, so basically, did the accuracy of the numbers matter to them? Or was it being numbers good enough, right? And the preliminary evidence suggests it may be the former, that having good data really did matter to them, that they wanted to make sure that the totals, the subtotals, the data that was transferred from place to place was as accurate as possible. Absolutely, people fudge reporting plague burials during epidemics due to various social pressures, such as families not wanting to quarantine. And some of the bill's readers understood the problems of the underreporting. But at other times, the bills show evidence of extreme attention to detail. One particularly morbid example, there is a gunpowder explosion. And so they give counts of how many people died from what parish. And then they make explicit mention of a pile of body parts that they couldn't identify or figure out how to count. So they're saying, we can't give you a number, but we're going to describe the situation in which we are unable to provide a number for you. In the early 17th century, occasionally parishes that reported hundreds of burials a week sometimes failed to turn in their weekly counts and were simply recorded as zero. But by the 18th century, parishes that failed to report would be called out at the bottom of the bills as having not turned in their numbers on time. They couldn't leave blanks, which were implicit zeros, or report obviously wrong data, the explicit zero, but they felt the need and the obligation to flag or report this wrong data with the data set. And so a lot of scholars look at these callouts in the early 18th century and they conclude people are losing interest in the bills since plague is passed and they no longer consider it important to get the data right. And it's certainly fair to say that a couple of the parish clerks are really falling down on the job, but they come from larger, overworked parishes with really high death rates. The vast majority of the clerks get their data in on time, and the compilers felt the need to be very clear about the limitations of the data. And I would argue this shows the continuing importance of the data to people compiling and tracking and publishing. Even if the majority of the population isn't avidly following every week, a minority of the population considers it of great importance. And it's of so much importance that it continues for another 100 years till 1859. And in the early 19th century, they're actually revamped into a statistical series that is published by the secular government and continues to the present day. So early modern Londoners were deeply invested in the bills, in producing the data, in totaling and copying, and put a lot of faith, sometimes literal, in the quantitative mortality data produced. And the epistemological power of these numbers lay as much in their perceived accuracy as in the fact that they're numbers. We know that there's errors in the data, and I can talk way more about this in Q&A if you're interested, but the data was good enough that people treat it as seriously as we treat our data today. So I've definitely talked long enough at this point. So here's the project URL. Enjoy the data and the data visualizations, and I'm happy to answer any questions in Q&A.
Well, great, Jessica. Thank you very much. And as just a reminder to our listeners today or our viewers, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat or do use the raise your hand feature. And I'll start off with a couple. I have a bunch of historical questions, but also a few technical questions. But I mean, as you were talking, Jessica, I was really struck by how very modern this type of work is. Until very recently, certain governments collected such data rigorously and used that to advance scientific knowledge and policymaking. And so I'm wondering, when this data collection really ramps up in the 17th century, what ways how does the state thinking about how to use this information? Is it using it to make policy decisions? Is it using it to move people from one parish to another to avoid greater conflagrations of the plague? How are they deploying it? How are they deploying this knowledge?
They're deploying it on a pretty simple level. It's, do we shut down the theaters? Kind of, like, are we going to have a shutdown? Are we going to quarantine the city? Are we going to flee the city? And so you see people also using it to know like when they should update their wills, right? And so they're using it at a very simple level of like, is the plague getting worse or is it getting better? And in fact, one of the things I didn't highlight every single piece of data on the bills, but one of the things that they flag is plague increasing or decreasing across the city, and how many parishes are infected and how many parishes are clear of the plague. So they're looking at it at that level. That's kind of the level that the government is making policy. Um, but by the time we get to the 1660s, there's shall we say, a private awareness that more could be done with the bills. So famously in 1662, a guy by the name of John Grant uses his shopkeeper's arithmetic to analyze the bills of mortality he can get his hands on. This is considered kind of like the genesis of modern demography and statistical analysis of populations. And so we get what's called the political arithmetic in the late 17th century. early 18th century. There are big name guys who are playing around with the numbers in the bills of mortality and trying to make governmental policy recommendations on them. It's unclear how seriously anyone takes them, but they are attempting to do it. And the example that comes to mind, because it's so horrific, it always sticks in my mind. Dublin, over in Ireland, does have its own bills of mortality series by this time. And so a guy by the name of William Petty looks at the Dublin Bills of Mortality and uses them to calculate how many women from England should be shipped to Ireland and how many Irish women should be shipped to England in order to commit cultural genocide and destroy the Irish nation. And so, that's clearly a policy recommendation that no one ever followed up on, thank goodness. But so there's definitely private interest, but the level of government interest in the statistics is much lower.
The other thing that struck me too was the religious dimension. In some ways, I would have expected sort of more accurate or quantifiable knowledge about humanity, about the world in which they are living in, would have in some ways potentially broken a link with God or a faith, as you might say. When there's high degrees of accuracy, then in some ways faith becomes less important because uh, something's more knowable. But in the example you gave, quite interestingly, the numbers are providing evidence that even though you could say God has brought this scourge, he's also evident or present in its relief. Is that kind of a fair way to think about it?
Yeah. So this is the slide I put at the bottom of the presentation and skipped because I didn't want to go into the Lord have mercies. But this is an example of the type of publication that often circulates during epidemics. So it's literally like a series of prayers that you should be saying to God, surrounded by data. And it's a little hard to see because this is a black and white one. But this is actually hand filled in data from the bills of mortality. So this was printed partway through the epidemic in 1636, and people are literally like copying the numbers into the side of this little prayer bulletin. um, and so what we see then is that religion and numbers are very closely intertwined in this time period. There's actually part of the Bible, it's part of the Apocrypha, but it's sort of in the Bible, that says God created the world by number, weight, and measure. So the implication being that the mechanism by which God created the world is this sort of quantitative science that is developing in this time period. And so by studying this, we are understanding God's creation better and like God's will as expressed through this. And they understood God had two different types of providence, sort of like a sustaining providence that, like, just, he made the world and it's running, and then the miraculous intervention in the natural order. And so by looking at these numbers, they could examine both, right? The sort of natural rules that govern plague in this, and also God being pissed off because they've sinned and like they need to repent. And so, like, Bomford, whose little sermon I read part of, he's in particular, like, he's like, oh, we must go after the alehouse people because that's why there's plague. And so, these ideas then are very tightly intertwined.
Yeah, that all adds up. Amy's got a question.
All right, yes. This is all very interesting. I think as Jim alluded to, I also thought of the CDC and the weekly morbidity and mortality reports. And I hope you go before a congressional committee and say how important these are, like even in retrospect, like for knowing, gathering information about a society.
Well, I think it's important to recognize the NSF funded this work, so it's being funded by the NSF. So there are some people who recognize its importance.
So I had a question about Sir William Petty, and I guess you already alluded to that. But I guess I want to piggyback more on Jim's question on religion and whether continental countries kept um, numbers. Like, is there a Protestant Catholic divide?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not as familiar with the continental tracking as with the British tracking, of course. I know that Geneva starts its own series shortly after. Um, there's is it Silesia? Silesia gets one because that's what the life annuity tables actually are built off of in the
Mm.
early 18th century. I don't think that there is a Catholic Protestant divide on this front. I think it has more to do with secular government and who has the ability to collect the data, who has the infrastructure in place to collect it. So it's easier in some ways for the British. They're a very centralized monarchy. They have this capital city that's under their control. And of course, then they take over the Church of England and they're using it that way. But there was nothing that fundamentally required Catholicism, right? The parish clerks could have or required Protestantism. The parish clerks could have done this as Catholic parish clerks and still submitted it, right? The Pope would not have been like, no, don't collect data. That wouldn't have been a theological argument. So I don't know how much this is tracked on the continent. I do know that eventually the French start tracking their data too, but I don't know the dates offhand for that.
And then lastly, I just want to remark there are questions popping up. But you said you posed a question: did the government really pay attention? And then I think I've studied the slave trade debate in the late 18th century, and so many numbers are generated by then. So in the Board of Trade obviously really loves numbers 100 years later. So there's an interesting shift there in the government.
And they are looking at the numbers at a very like facile level of like numbers are going up. I would like to leave the city now, right? But like not the kind of deep quantitative analysis that we sometimes think about. So like there are people who are like studying starvation deaths across the city by the end of the 17th century, and the government is not doing studies of starvation deaths. They do pay attention to the numbers though, in a kind of like PR sense. There's one incident during the interregnum. Actually, it might be still during the Civil Wars. At any rate, during the 1640s or 50s, I forget exactly when it is, where the Bills of Mortality report 3 Cavaliers starved to death in prison. And then the next week, there is a recantation saying, no, no, the searchers made it all up. We would never starve to death our enemy soldiers in prison. Whether what actually happened there, I don't know, but like someone clearly noticed this and took alarm and made them print the retraction. So yes.
Thank you, Amy. Kirsten has a question. How does violent death show up? Could these numbers or figures be used to track violence targeting women and or children?
So violent deaths usually show up with quite a bit of detail. And if you're really interested in violent death, I recommend Craig Spence, Accidents and Violent Death in Early Modern London. There we go. He looks specifically at the accidents and the violence in the bills of mortality, and so that's a good book on it. So the kind of murders and suicides and things like that are usually flagged. Should we say with the PPI removed? And so they'll just say like one person stabbed. They will flag a child sometimes when the death is of a child, but not always. You can definitely get some sense of infanticide through them. They usually flag when someone has been found dead and is a child, and like there definitely have been bodies found in latrines, and it's always flagged when it is a baby's body, implied some sort of infant death or infanticide there. Um, they don't tend to tell you about violence towards women versus men. So they care about violence towards children, but not so much gender once you're an adult. So like we had someone died this week from being wounded in the hand. They were murdered by being wounded in the hand. So clearly someone like stabbed them or something. I don't know if the person was a man or a woman, but uh, we do. There is one incident where we see an older child's death being flagged, and that's very specifically because it is a like heinous crime. Basically, a child is beaten to death by their school teacher, and so this one is flagged very explicitly in the bills. But in general, unless it's a baby they don't give you the demographic information on the they really try and keep it anonymous. It's they'll tell you how they're killed and they'll tell you where they're killed, but not their information. You could cross-check it against parish registers for the parish registers that survive and get more information, but so many of those parish registers don't survive. It would be hard.
Well, thank you, Kirsten. And Cheryl's got a question. I've started reading your book, and I'm wondering how the spread of knowledge and the use of Arabic numbers among the English populace played into the popularity of the mortality bills.
Yeah. So there will if you get later in the book, there is one chapter where I talk about the bills of mortality, but not in huge amount of detail. I definitely think the two are related. So in my book, I talk about rising literacy rates and the transition from shall we say, multiplistic numeracy, right? Using multiple forms of numeracy side by side to Arabic numerals being kind of the dominant form of numeracy. And that is happening in large part because of the printing revolution, the rise of literacy rates, and the fact that it is easier and faster to teach Arabic numeral mathematics in print than it is to teach counting board mathematics or tally stick mathematics, right? Like, Arabic numerals being a print medium and arithmetic being done with them means that they are sort of the newly literate form of numeracy. And so we definitely see that happening at the same time that the population is looking at numbers and looking at how um, numbers can be used to explain the world. And so they definitely are interrelated phenomenon. Um, I'm hesitant to say like one causes the other. That feels overly simplistic. I think that they are correlated rather than causal. Um, but yes, they definitely there's a greater percent of the population that is reading numbers, that is reading Arabic numeral numbers. And in fact, the first moment I found the bills of mortality, when I was doing research for that book, I was looking through this old parish register, and the priest at the time was using Roman numerals for everything except the year of the incarnation, which is a very standard pattern. The book goes on and on about why, and basically it's because Arabic numerals are really bad. Um, they're very easy to forge, and there's lots of problems with them, so they're used very cautiously. Um, but as I was going through this parish priest, everything was in Roman numerals except the year of the incarnation. And then all of a sudden, he listed the number of people who died that year in his parish and how many died of plague using Arabic numerals. And so he was clearly modeling off of the 1603 bills of mortality. The 1603 is when it happened, when he recorded that information. And so he used Arabic numerals to do it. And it's worth noting that in some of those slides I showed you, some of the early bills are using Roman numerals, but when they choose to print for the general population, they do go with Arabic numerals for the printed bills of mortality.
Thank you, Cheryl. Jessica, I wonder if you can take us underneath the hood a little bit and talk about the digital architecture that underlies this project. What is it built in, and what was the process of building it or continuing to build it still?
Yeah, yeah. So the the tech stack of this project has definitely evolved a lot over time. Um, the actual transcriptions are done with Omeka S. So before this project was funded, the sort of previous funded project that I worked on related to this was creating a structured data transcription module for Omeka S. It's called DataScribe. Um, and so basically, it is a plugin or a module, whichever one you want to call it, for Omeka S that lets you set up a form and will display your digitized images alongside the form so that you can transcribe back and forth. And I don't have a good slide immediately to hand on that, but I could just open it and show you what it looks like. You so here is the module. You can see the projects that we've got going. So the plague and general mortality are the front of the bills. The diseases and casualties are on the back of the bills. Miscellaneous other stuff is like the age data and the bread data. And then you can see I've got some other ones that are just sort of functional. And so I've got I organized them by holding library so that I could always figure out like where the bill of mortality had originally come from, like where is the original document. So this is from Queen's College Library in Oxford. And as you go in here, you create records and you submit them for review. Set the image. All right, here we go. So this is kind of what the interface looks like. So this is the bill, and here is the form where we're transcribing. And because I was transcribing the back of the bills, oops, this was obviously a place where I was having trouble photographing. Um, into this crack was always an exciting part of doing the archival research when these are bound volumes. And so you don't do that. Um, so we've got a form, you go through and you put in the information as you go through and find it on your way down the bill. Um, and then once you're done with it, you submit it for review. This one hasn't been reviewed yet. Everything that we did for the project uh, has been transcribed and then reviewed by someone else. So there's always two people who look at the data. And this has helped eliminate most, but not all of the issues in the data set. So then we export it. And then there's usually like another layer of kind of like review that happens, just kind of like looking at the spreadsheet and being like, yes, all of the unique IDs look like they've been transcribed right, and like there's no extra zeros and things like that. Um, and then we are uploading them onto the website. And so the Death by Numbers website, our developer Jason has been doing that one. We are kind of using static site um, technologies as much as possible because having done sustainability work for the center, total whole other conversation. But let me just say that anything that is built on a content management system is going to fall apart in 5 to 7 years. Anything that is built on static HTML will be fine if looking a little janky and old fashioned, 30 years later. And so we've been using like Hugo for the blog parts of this, and as much as possible, trying to make the site static. It's not a completely static site because we have the database and the API, and you can make API calls to it. But as much as possible, we attempted to reduce these kinds of dependencies because with all grant funded projects, once the grant ends, the funding for sustaining it ends. And I was told once upon a time that the NEH was very happy if things survive like 3 to 5 years after funding ended, and that is in alignment with kind of sustainability studies done in the profession, that a lot of things don't make it past the 3 to 5 year mark. And we're all historians. We're working with hundreds of years old documents. Like the thought of something only lasting 3 to 5 years hurts our souls. And so, yes, so as much as possible, I try and use static site technologies. And the way that the data is exported from the project, fundamentally at the end of the day, it is all CSVs. So all of the data is taken from CSVs into the database, into the API, and you can download the CSVs and you can have copies. I have copies, which is a durable open source format that 100 years from now, we better still be able to read CSVs, or we won't have computers anymore. One or the other.
Several of our guests, Jessica, on the Coffee House series have begun using artificial intelligence both to transcribe manuscript documents, but also printed documents. Do you see a role for artificial intelligence in this project, or is the workflow that you've established such that it works? Why break it? Let's keep going as it is, and it helps students learn the craft of history that way.
So before I went through this extremely time consuming, labor intensive process of manually transcribing and checking everything, I tried to use the basically optical character recognition and other technologies that are basically the forerunners of what we've got now, on the bills of mortality. And the problem is the bills of mortality were cheap, fastly produced, 400-year-old documents. So they're in really bad shape and they're really hard for a human to read, much less a machine. And when we talk about like good OCR, we're like, yay, we got like 95% accuracy. I'm sorry, if you mess up 5% of my data set when I'm trying to study, if the numbers are right, like it's not gonna work. And so the technology is not there. I spent a year fighting with OCR, thinking like maybe the technology, no, it was not there when I first started doing it. Every time I've come back to it, it has produced inferior quality data to what my students have been able to produce. So the technology is just not there yet. Would I love it if I could get a first pass with AI and then my student transcribers could all be student reviewers? Yes, that would be great. The reviewing process is very similar to the transcribing process, and that you go through the bills, you check all the numbers, you just, don't have to be the one writing them on the form. At this point, you just check the numbers match and then you update them if they're wrong, right? Like if I could get all of my students to doing that, it would be fabulous. But the technology isn't there yet. Ask me again in 5 years, maybe. Um, but because of the quality of the original sources, we're not there, and because of the high level of accuracy required, right? If this were transcribing just the text data, right? If what I wanted out of the bills was give me all those weird descriptions of the person who was killed by the overturned coach, or um, one that has become infamous, the person who was killed when their neighbor was throwing a stick at a rooster and hit them instead, right? If that was what I was trying to get out of the bills of mortality, OCR could probably do it, right? Because like they might get a couple of characters wrong, but I would be able to look at it and sort of figure out, oh, that means one, not like Ole was killed, right? One was killed. And so that kind of data, but because I want the quantitative data and because the printing is just so bad, um, I'm trying to think, do I have a good example? For a while, I was trying to track like how bad some of these numbers are. And so here's actually a good example. Um, this is a 4. AI is not yet to the point where they can tell me that this is a 4, but a human can. Maybe someone who spent a year training the AI based on what the humans learned how to do, but I can train an undergrad in about 2 hours. So it just hasn't been worth the effort to try and see if I can train AI to do this thing when I know the students can if I just give them a little time.
Well, tell us a little bit about the students, and we've got about 12 minutes left. And but I often, as I alluded to at the beginning of our discussion, sometimes I'll be walking around the office seeing gaggles of your students in intense conversations debating the meaning of a word that signifies some kind of death or the cause of a death. Tell us a little bit about how you have incorporated students into this project.
Yeah. So like I said, I figured out this was going to have to be done manually, and so this was going to require a team, or it was going to take my entire career. And so one of the things that I really wanted to do with this project was not just use my students for their labor and then be like, "Yay, thank you" in the front of my book and move on. I wanted them to get something out of it. And so the students who join the team are generally, very interested in this kind of information to begin with, right? Like they ask to be on the team because they're like, this sounds cool. And I always train them on the front of the bills, which is the plague data, so that they learn to use the interface and they learn to read the documents before I let them loose on the really fun stuff, which is the weird ways to die on the back of the data. So they always get excited when they're promoted to the back of the bills. And we have a sort of ontology of different kinds of death. And the ones that are always really tricky are what we count as murder, suicide, and other. And sometimes we also, the drowning and found dead deaths also get a little weird. Like if you're found dead in the Thames, is this a drowning death or is it a found dead death? Right? The answer is found dead, because they specifically say you were found dead in the Thames rather than saying that you have drowned. So since they said they didn't call it a drowning death, it goes into the found dead, and the Thames just happens to be where you were found dead, rather than, in the streets, or everybody's favorite, found dead in a coffin. And so the one that they really struggle with, though, and I struggle with also, is the difference between killed and other deaths. And other includes accidental deaths. Killed deaths happen because of human agency, is how we've defined them in the bills. So if someone says, if the bills say you have been killed by a stone falling off the roof of the house, that is actually an other death, not a killed death, because a human didn't throw the stone off the roof of the house on you, right? Like, there was no human agency in this death. Um, but if you are killed by a cart, there is human agency, because presumably a human was driving the cart that then ran over you. And so we have these intense discussions about the way humans interact with their built environment, and the ways humans do or do not have control over the animals and the objects that surround them. And the students really get fascinated by these deep dive conversations into, fundamentally, at the end of the day, could a human have stopped this death? Right? Is what that question that, like, underlies that categorization is. Um, and so the students get really interested, both because, like, there's some really weird ways to die. I've mentioned a few of them. Another perennial favorite is choking to death on a silver spoon, which just implies choking on your privilege, but they mean a literal silver spoon. And so, they just get fascinated by these evidences of daily life. And I've had to do some deep dives into the OED to answer questions about, like, the tools that a Cooper uses. Nobody has asked me yet about the silk weaver's star that started the example here. But, like, people just get killed with weird daily objects, and then the students want to know more about them. And so then I have to go do research on this, and they do independent research on it, and they've picked up some of my tricks. I've quoted the OED enough at them that they all now know to go to the OED. And the thing I love about this is it's not the kind of history they would ever learn in the classroom, right? It's the kind of, like, weird rabbit holes that you go down doing actual archival historical research. And they're learning how to do that, and learning the kinds of questions that arise when you do that.
Yeah, just questions brought up by exactly that. I noticed on the piece that you showed us, as far as the transcription, there was a death, I think, called Shining of the Lights, something like that.
Probably Rising of the Lights.
Rising of the Lights. Yeah, what is that?
That's a lung ailment. So it's it's
Oh,
your lung. So lights is often used as, like, a word for lungs. So
okay,
it's a lung ailment. Um,
okay.
we actually, on the website, have what I like to call the death dictionary.
Ah,
So when you go to the website, um, you have kind of like our uh,
nice. Okay.
in development. Uh, so here we go.
Ah, there we go. Difficulty breathing or a choking sensation.
Yep. Here's Running of the Rains is another one with a weird name.
Okay.
And so just kind of,
Right. Oh, fascinating.
yep.
And how do you die choking on a spoon? I wonder. I mean, that sounds like
Oh,
somebody, right? How is
um,
that possible?
I'm so this is a good question. Again, the bills of mortality don't give a ton of data about people. I kind of wonder if that one in particular wasn't a child death, right? Like, I could see a baby choking, um,
Yeah.
or somebody who had some sort of episode while they were trying to eat. It's
Right.
hard to say, right?
Yeah.
I
Or like epilepsy or something, right? If they had to
Yeah.
like suppress the tongue with a spoon, I don't know if it was. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they definitely they recognized epilepsy, although I would have expected
Mm,
that as a convulsion death, but it could have been.
yeah.
It's one of the things about the bills, I always want more information about some of these. Be like, how in the world did you do that? People,
That's fascinating. So then the other question I had too, and I think you alluded to this somewhat, saying there was a merchant who was doing this. I was wondering if you have seen other databases, things looking at, or other information, especially about the rise of certain types of industries, like cottage industries, different things that would seem to actually maybe have some correlation to your data. And maybe your data, like maybe your data is actually showing something about that that hasn't been adduced yet, in the sense of like essentially some sort of ambulance chasing, right? That's going on where you're like, oh, right? When you think about it, like there you see that ebb and flow, right? That this is whatever. Because when you were first saying this, I was thinking like, oh, are people also partly collecting these things because they're thinking like, oh, well, buy that real estate. Now, of course, that would assume that the people own the real estate, which they probably don't, right? But like, is that partly why people are so interested in collecting these things, is getting this data, is that they want to use it to get rich as opposed to also be afraid of something? Yeah.
So we only see people really begin collecting and analyzing the data into the 17th century. And usually the examples I've seen, they usually want to answer social questions, right? So the example I gave of the starvation deaths, they want to know, like, are people really starving to death? If so, how many and where? The John Grant does a little digression into like syphilis deaths, and like, where are people dying of the French pox is what it's called at the time. And so, he's just kind of interested. He's like, everybody has the French pox, it feels like, but like no one's being diagnosed as dying of it. So like, is it just not that deadly? Or are we just, obscuring all the data? Like, what's going on? And so people are interested in kind of these social questions, rather than like personal enrichment. One of the things that I definitely want to do once all the data is done being transcribed, we did the plague stuff first, because that's the heart of my research agenda. And now we're on to the back of the bills, all the fun stuff. Things that we would love to analyze is, like industrial accidents, how they change over time, construction accidents, right? There's, a lot of people have construction accidents or accidents related to when the Great Storm of 1707 comes through, 1707, 17, now I'm forgetting the exact date. There's a big storm. It's like a hurricane. And a bunch of roof tiles and chimneys collapse. And you see that in the bills of mortality. You see that kind of data. We see a lot of construction accidents in the wake of the Great Fire, like people dying as they rebuild the city. And so one of the things I do want to do is kind of track these sorts of accidents over time. So like, is drowning in the brewer's mash, another one of everybody's favorites, a type of accident that remains steady over time, or does it, decline in frequency or increase in frequency? These are the kinds of things we'll be able to ask and answer, and the kinds of questions that I've been throwing to the students and saying, like, go for it. If you want to study, brewers mashes over time, that's a great blog post kind of level research question.
Well, Jessica, we come to the end of our time today. Thank you very much. This has been really fascinating. I appreciate you coming out today.
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
And I put the website URL at the top of the chat, but you're welcome to go download the data, play with the data. We are iteratively updating it, so not all the data is in there yet. Give us another 6 months, and hopefully all the data will be there.
You too can find fun ways to die in the bills of mortality.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care, everybody. We'll be back in 2 weeks for our final coffee house of the season. Until then, take care.